I supposed the United States will always be unready for war, and in consequence, will always be exposed to great expense and to the possibility of the gravest calamity when the nation goes to war. This is no new thing. Americans learn only from catastrophes and not from experience. Our Army and Navy, and above all our people, learned some lessons from the Spanish War and applied them to our own uses. During the following decade, the improvement in our Navy and Army was very great, not in materiel alone, but also in personnel, and above all, in the ability to handle our forces in good-sized units.
If Theodore Roosevelt's assessment of the state of the Army at the time of the Spanish-American War sounds harsh, it is no worse than that of the U.S. Army Center of Military History.
In the spring and summer of 1898, thousands of enthusiastic volunteers, a few with some militia training, but most only raw recruits, poured into the newly established camps in the South. But a taste of military life in the training camps soon curbed the enthusiasm of most volunteers, for there they found chronic shortages of the most essential equipment, even of such basic items such as underwear, socks, and shoes, a steady diet of badly prepared food, unbelievably poor sanitary conditions, inadequate medical facilities, and a lack of up-to-date weapons. A similar general inefficiency characterized the War Department's conduct of actual operations against Spain.
Although the American military soundly defeated the Spanish, the deficiencies of the Army organization were clear. This was also a time of advancements in weapons, communications, and transportation. If America was to have an active role in the world, it would need to modernize its Army. At the start of the new century, the Army went through significant organizational and administrative changes to eliminate the widespread inefficiencies of the U.S. War Department. And it would have to do it quickly, because although they didn't know it, war was coming soon. A war beyond anything the world had known before. The man tapped to steer these changes was Elihu Root, Secretary of War under President McKinley and then President Theodore Roosevelt after McKinley's assassination. Root identified three main areas in need of reform: the branches and schools, the command structure, and the National Guard. A third of the regular Army officers had no military education. Secretary Root, in 1901, announced a new, comprehensive system of officer education. It was composed of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the General Service and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, and 5 special services schools. In 1904, the Army added post schools for instructing enlisted men. The Army schools, except in West Point, were supervised through the Army War College. The next area that Root saw needing reform was the National Guard. Over its history, the National Guard, which can trace its roots to militia units that existed before the nation's founding, contributed substantially to victories in major wars and minor battles. But over the 19th century, the state-based system of militias had become a disorganized, inconsistently equipped and trained, unwieldy force. At the time of the Spanish-American War, the president had the authority to call for troops, but each state determined how it would meet its quota. Usually, the governor would call for the National Guard units to volunteer, but they were under no legal obligation to do so. Many refused, and many who did volunteer failed their physical exam. States met their quota then by recruiting civilians who, despite their personal courage, were not prepared for war. In 1903, Congress acted to institute reforms identified by Elihu Root, which would give the federal government a larger role in the system. The Militia Act of 1903 addressed some of the weaknesses of the state militias. The President would now have the authority to call up the Guard for 9 months of federal service rather than 3. A few years later, the act would be amended to remove any limit to the service. Guardsmen were required by law to answer the President's call, and states were required to organize, equip, and train the Guard according to the standards of the regular Army. In 1916, as World War I raged across Europe and the U.S. seemed increasingly likely to become involved, the National Defense Act would complete the conversion of the haphazard state militias into a well-trained, fully equipped, reserved force of the U.S. Army. The act gave the War Department the authority to determine the type and number of units for each state, and required Guardsmen to take an oath of loyalty to the federal as well as to the state government. The act also greatly enlarged the nation's military force, authorizing a peacetime regular army of 175,000 men to be enlarged to almost 300,000 in wartime. Meanwhile, the size of the National Guard was quadrupled to 400,000 citizen soldiers obligated to respond when the President called, though the Guard would still answer to the governor as their commander-in-chief at all other times. The 1916 Act created a new Reserve Officer Training Corps program to establish training centers for officers at colleges and universities. Changes were also made to the criteria for the nation's highest combat award, the Medal of Honor. To further raise the bar for that highest award, in 1918, Congress created the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star in response to a recommendation from General Pershing. He pointed out the need to recognize actions that were valorous but not above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor would now be reserved for the most extraordinary examples of valor. Henceforth, the Medal of Honor would only be bestowed upon individuals in the Army, Navy, or Marines who distinguished themselves conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their lives above and beyond the call of duty while engaged in armed conflict. Despite the tightening of the rules, 119 men would be awarded the Medal of Honor for their valorous actions during World War I. Before that war, the U.S. Army had the opportunity to test some of its organizational improvements on a smaller conflict in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution was spilling over into the U.S. Angered by U.S. support for a rival, Pancho Villa, a former Mexican general and former governor of Chihuahua, now led a guerrilla army in a series of attacks along the border. In response to a raid on March 9, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson ordered Brigadier General John J. Pershing into Mexico. Although the Mexican government itself wished to capture Villa, it soon protested the presence of the U.S. Army within its borders. Hunting Villa became much more difficult, and within a few months, Wilson had called for 75,000 National Guardsmen to help police the border. Pershing was unable to capture Pancho Villa before being called to a larger task, the war in Europe. But they were able to bring an end to the violence along the border, and the event provided an excellent opportunity for regular Army and National Guard troops to train together in the field in intense conditions. The experience would help prepare them for what was to come.
If you're eager to see more of our historical documentaries, please like, share, and subscribe.